All right, I think I'm going to get started. Welcome, everybody, to AHS Digital Program Stalking the Wild Food, Experts of Tucson, Placekeepers, and Tastemakers with Laura Cortelyou. And I'm going to give a really quick intro to AHS, and then I will hand it over for this program that I've been looking forward to for a couple weeks now. So I'm very excited for you all to be here. All right, well, today I'm going to be the moderator. I'm Dr. Laura Key. I am curator and associate editor of the Journal of Arizona History, and I am joined by my friend here, Eric Gonzalez, who is the statewide facilities manager, and we are welcoming you to our program today. A little history about AHS. It was actually established by an act of the first territorial legislature on November 7th, 1864, right in the middle of the Civil War. The Arizona Historical Society is Arizona's oldest historical agency, and that we have 4 flagship museums across the state, as you can see there on our wonderful map. Number one, our mission, connecting people through the power of Arizona's history, which is what we most want to do, and to bring history to the people with digital programs like you see here. All right, for really exciting news, if you haven't joined us in a couple of months, is our new license plate is available. It is beautiful, monsoon license plate. Let's hope that our monsoon season is a little bit better than last year's, because I really miss the weather. So it's available now, so next time you get your vehicle registered, ask for the Arizona Historical Society license plate. Our museums are open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., where we have COVID-19 precautions, and that we have social distancing. So if you want to get out of the house and take a look at our museums, we welcome you. And if you're itching for a new exhibit, you're in luck. We have 2 upcoming exhibits: Unframed, a photo journey through Navajo and Hopi nations, 1977 through 1978. It looks at the photography of artist Catherine McKenna, of her travels through the Navajo and Hopi nations. This opens up at the Arizona Heritage Center at Papago Park, and on April 29th. And then ready to launch, Arizona's Place in Space. All systems are go for May 20th through May 30th. We have some great exhibits from NASA, from ASU and U of A. Just mark it on your calendar, because it's going to be a really good one. Upcoming virtual programs: The Girl in the Iron Box, how an Arizona kidnapping stumped Hoover's FBI. If you think you like the Lindbergh kidnapping, not that you like it, but you like studying it, you will like this book. It's about a young girl, Mexican-American girl in the 1930s who was kidnapped, and it's kind of a mystery. So please join us. The Arizona History Convention is taking place on April 22nd through the 24th. And next one is Ask the Authors, Seeing Arizona, Imagining Mars by Dr. Michael A. Amundsen. So all of those are coming up. Come join us for some other great digital programs. While you're there, become a member. With your membership, you get lots of stuff, and I'll leave it up there, but it's just what a great deal and makes a great gift. So Mother's Day is coming up, maybe, hey? Along with your membership, you get a subscription to the Journal of Arizona History. Our most recent one here is a double issue and features some of the most famous historians talking about Arizona's history, all available on Project Muse also. For our most announcements and events, join us at azhs.org. And finally, I know you couldn't wait till I get started, Stalking the Wild Food, Experts of Tucson, Placekeepers and Tastemakers with Laura Cortelyou. And I'm going to introduce her, and then I'm going to hand it over to her and let her take over. Laura is the 5th generation of her family to live in Long Beach, California. She was raised in Santa Barbara, where she developed a love and appreciation for coastal oak savanna, riparian areas, estuaries, and tide pools. These areas were imprinted with ancient cultures. Her former schooling, a Bachelor of Arts from the UC Santa Barbara in the history of art and architecture, and a master's degree in organizational development from Fielding Graduate University, was completed by learning from coastal Chumash leaders, Ernestine Ignacio de Soto, Roberta Cordero and Frank Lemos, who in the 1990s were active in preserving and reifying their ancient maritime-based traditions. She began to study wild foods around 2001, but did not have fun learning about wild foods until she took Pascal Baudar's foraging class in LA's Griffith Park in 2005. In 2013, she took an advanced permaculture teacher training at the Permacultural Design Institute in Santa Fe, where she met Katrina Blair of Turtle Lake Refuge, Durango, Colorado. Katrina asked the question, we've stopped eating wild foods, and now we have all kinds of disease and societal ills. What would happen if we started eating wild foods again? Would we become wild people again? That question has never left her mind since. And without further ado, I give you Laura Cortelyou, and I am going to stop sharing my screen and let her take over.
Thank you so much, Dr. Key. And thank you also, Eric Gonzalez, for inviting me to give this talk today. Welcome, everybody. And I can give you an answer to the question that Katrina Blair posed years ago. Yes, if you eat wild foods, it will turn you back into a wild human again. So that's the good news we're going to start off with. I have had the pleasure of working with a number of wild foods experts in Tucson over the past 4.5 years. And I'm going to share who they are and some of the other people who are also developing knowledge and who are currently sharing that knowledge. I started working on developing the Marana Gastronomy Tour program about 4.5 years ago. And I'm extremely grateful, and I was very lucky that I had early support and help from TJ Morgan, whose family has owned and operated Gray Line tours in Tucson for more than 100 years. So TJ was an early supporter of this program, and he, fortunately for me, was skeptical. We launched the first tour that was primarily based around ancient archaeology sites and food tastings of ancient foods and wild foods. After a year, I realized I really wanted to develop a second tour, and it had to have a wild foods walkabout at the center of it with a wild foods expert. And TJ was very skeptical that anybody would find this interesting. And so I got to set it up for him to experience himself. So here's someone whose family has been in tourism for more than 100 years. He developed the internationally renowned tour about the border about 10 or so years ago that became famous because he took people to the border at Nogales and went on the Arizona side of Nogales and the Mexico side of Nogales and introduced tourists to people on both sides of the border so that they could have their own experiences of the border. And so TJ is fearless, and he's done many different kinds of tours, and he's had tour buses break down all kinds of stuff. I have to say, at the end of the Wild Foods tour, he was so excited, he named it. And the name he gave the tour was A Taste of the Wild. So I hope we can infuse this with some of that enthusiasm and excitement, and you can see why this is exciting. Obviously, you're here, so you already have an interest. I was also very lucky to have Christy Simone be an early supporter of the kinds of gastronomy tours that I was developing. He developed the Best 23 Miles of Mexican Food tour. That was really the first kind of gastronomy tour of that type that he ran for TJ Morgan as part of Gray Line Tours for many, many, many years. So Chris was also really helpful giving feedback. So I'll just say quickly before I jump in, this is structured not as a narrative history of how people have been doing wild foods in this area. And it's not an institutional history either. This is structured more like a wild foods walkabout. Who may we find in the field right now if we were to go and have a wild foods walkabout? So who is working currently and sharing their knowledge and producing new knowledge and teaching classes, giving talks, writing books, and being public sort of public intellectuals or public historians, knowledge keepers, foodways keepers, who you may encounter at this very moment in time. Because this is a large subject. There are many people who have played critically important roles, and many of them have passed on, and some have retired, and some are just not currently giving tours. So what I wanted to do was try to set you up so that you know a little bit more about wild foods, develop an appetite for wild foods, and then have information so that you may find breakfast, lunch, and dinner this weekend, where you may dine on wild foods if you so wish. So let's get going. I think I need to share my screen, and here we go.
While you're doing that, I just want to say if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box and I will be monitoring that.
Yes, please do ask questions at any time. So here is our program for this talk. I'm going to give you a really quick introduction to what we are talking about when we say wild foods in this region. I will introduce you to the people. So these are the people who are teaching and giving tours and producing wild foods. We'll start with the Native American people who are reifying their traditional foodways at this moment in time. We will also talk about the foragers and the authors who are writing and educating us about wild foods. And then the tastemakers who may be chefs and brewers and artisanal bakers. People who are providing foods now, finished foods that we have the opportunity to go and taste. We will have a virtual field trip. So if you needed some further incentive to try to get out and taste some wild flavors, you will know exactly what to look for on menus. And there are some pretty wild things. We're going to be looking at menus of restaurants that can change their menus as often as every day or every month. So you don't ever know really what's going to be on their menu. So we're really doing some field work today. And also, finally, I'll have a slide on many sources that you may use online as well as stores to find both ingredients for cooking and also prepared wild foods. So what do we mean when we are talking about wild foods? In the Sonoran Desert, it is said that there are 450 edible wild foods, and many of them taste delicious. I created this chart because I couldn't find one when I was developing the gastronomy tours, and I wanted people to know that there are 3 different main kinds of foods that we find here. And they aren't all, it's not really appropriate to refer to them all with just heritage. That doesn't tell you whose heritage, and it doesn't tell you how old they are. Wild foods are distinctively different. Those are foods that are older than 10,000 years ago. So that's really what we can think of as human food. It's the foods that all of our ancestors would have eaten that were wild wherever our ancestors came from 10,000 years ago. So here in this region, the wild foods would be acorns, barrel cactus fruit, cholla bud, chiltepine, chili peppers, desert hackberry, mesquite pods, nopales that are also, cactus petals that we see everywhere. And those petals bear prickly pear fruit and wolfberry. So those are just a couple of, we're talking 450 different kinds of edible wild foods. And those are just some highlights, but those are the ones, not the only ones that you'll see on menus, but those are very popular because their flavors are so compelling that contemporary chefs love to work with those foods in particular. We have a very special class of foods here that are so rare that you almost won't find them anywhere else. The ancient domesticated native foods that were domesticated more than 5,000 years ago and farmed on a large scale using very sophisticated agricultural techniques. Agave was farmed, thousands of acres of agaves were farmed at one time here in this area. Amaranth, maize, we call it corn. Maize has continued to be pushed back here for being a major agricultural crop. We'll get to that in just a second, because there has been a recent really exciting discovery around corn agriculture here. Pumpkin, squash, sunflower, tepary beans. Tepary beans have a whole, you could write books about just tepary beans alone. There's such a compelling story around that. We're going to meet somebody who was instrumental in preserving and bringing back tepary beans. And it took many, many people, but we're going to meet one of them. And then, of course, we're all familiar with the European foods that we can call heritage foods, that we know: avocados, citrus, any of the domesticated livestock, figs, grapes, pomegranates, stone fruits, and white Sonora wheat. Those were brought by Europeans here. So now we kind of have an idea of where we're going to spend most of our time in the wild foods column. And we're going to look at, why do we have all these wild foods? What is going on here? And what's going on is something really, truly unique to the Americas. And we keep discovering things. Archaeologists are finding things out really all the time. Every time that there's development and a new survey, there's the possibility of overturning all of the previous assumptions, or confirming some theories about just how old agriculture is in this area. And
I have a quick question, Laura. I'm sorry to bother you, but it came in from chat. A couple asked if you would be sharing your PowerPoint notes, or should they just keep notes themselves? We don't usually share it as AHS, so just to let you know.
I'm happy to share it.
Okay,
people may also take photos of screens if they want to take photos too. So
great. Thank you.
So, yes, thank you. Okay, so there have been Clovis points found here that date around 13,000 years ago. Whether there's a lot of debate I won't get into about who, the descendancy of what are called the Paleo people from 13,000 years ago up to the present time. It's really clear though that people have lived here in the greater Tucson Basin area and Marana because of a lot of surface water that would flow from Santa Cruz River, Cañada del Oro, and Rillito rivers, and the presence of really super old mortar hulls that are grinding stones that were used to grind mesquite pods gives us a hint of just how long people have lived here and had access to many wild foods to be able to live off the land. It's believed that some of these mortar holes, the ones I'm in particular in Marana, may be as old as 8,000 years old, and that there are petroglyphs that match up to roughly that time period. That was information that I received from Dr. Suzanne Fish, who is a renowned Hohokam foodways expert, and professor emerita and curator emerita from the University of Arizona and the Arizona State Museum. So when she gives tours of Los Morteros Conservation Area in Marana, she will say these mortar holes may be as old as 8,000 years old. In December of 2019, 5,500-year-old corn was discovered on Ina Road at Las Capas archaeology site between Silver Bell Road and the I-10 on Ina Road. And previously, that site had yielded a discovery of 4,000-year-old sophisticated agriculture. So again, I'm slipping out of wild foods for a second, but just to set you up for the fact that agriculture may have been invented here, because 5,500-year-old corn, if there's associated sophisticated agricultural techniques for growing that corn, they found the corn, they need to find the structures that go with the corn. That means people had been here already for a really long time. And the abundance of wild foods would certainly support that continual occupation here that could then make this an excellent site for agriculture, but not just any old agriculture. The invention of early agriculture may have actually happened here, and it's believed that it would be simultaneous with sophisticated agriculture being invented in Peru about the same time. So these are 2 dots on a map of only 5 dots on a map that would go back to 5,500-year-old sophisticated agriculture. So when you're talking about wild foods, that's relevant because you back it up and it tells you that people knew this area very well and it was suitable for growing things. And there's a term that describes the time period in between just wild foods foraging and agriculture, and that's called assisted agriculture, where people were assisting wild foods. So it may not look like formal agriculture as we know it today, but there was an element of human co-creation with wild foods to feed their populations. So I will go on to who are some of the people who you may find and learn from at this time, this moment in time. And wild foods interest and knowledge and sharing of that knowledge and practices has really exploded here in about the last 10 years. So many of these people are now doing things that weren't going on very recently, and some of them are continuing traditions that have gone on for thousands and thousands of years, but they are recovering their traditions. So we have, there are many Native American tribal members and Native American people who do not belong to a tribe formally, who are working with wild foods that are their traditional foods. And that would require many other talks worth of time. And so I'm focusing on these 4 people because these are people who are public intellectuals, public teachers, food producers, and people who will take you out into the field and teach you as well. Tanisha Tucker is a member of the Tohono O'odham tribe, and she, with her mother, who recently passed away, Stella Tucker, have continued their family's annual saguaro cactus fruit harvest in Saguaro National West. This was something that has gone on in their family for many generations, and it's possible that it's gone on for 10,000 years. That's how long the Tohono O'odham people have been in this region, according to their own traditions and their own histories. And they took they would, by limited number of people, only set up their camp. Usually saguaro fruit was harvested in the field with a temporary camp and harvested at the peak of summer heat. It's an incredibly important annual tradition because the harvest of the saguaro fruit is also the beginning of the new year for the Tohono O'odham people and also for the Yoan people. And we'll read a little bit more about that in a moment. So the Tucker family would invite regular people to join them on this annual tradition. And so there might be people who are on this, hearing this talk right now, who have been on that annual fruit harvest and know well how unique and special that would be. I have not had the chance to do that yet. But once the fruit is harvested, so you have saguaro fruit on saguaro cactus that may be as tall as 75 feet tall, and they have to be knocked down and caught and then boiled down into a syrup. And this is all done in the blazing heat of summer over a fire. And someone was just describing this to me who actually did go out with the Tuckers and do this, and said he couldn't believe that they could stand the heat of boiling down the syrup. And then it makes the most wonderful, rich, dark red syrup, and it's consumed through the year. And it's one of a kind flavors. And it's something you'll rarely come across. It's so rare that people still do this, and it's very hard to do. We have Gabriel Vega, who's one of many people who run Senevere Co-op Farm. He's currently the farm manager. I will talk about that farm in a second. Felipe Molina, who teaches, he's a linguist, a guide, author. He's amazing, and he is really doing a lot of important work to keep the Yoame, also known as Yaqui culture, alive for his people, as well as for those of us who may want to know more about that culture and its importance here. Also, in their oral histories, they have also been in the region for 10,000 years. Ramona Button was a very key person in saving Tupperware beans. So we're going to get to see more about her and see some photos of her magic beans that are a miracle that we still have them. And now they're showing up on menus in restaurants. So these folks are all very key, and they represent just a very small, this is just a small group of them, considering so many others who have been traditional farmers and have also started to revive these ways to bring them forward. So the Tucker family, we have a picture here of Tanisha's mother, Stella, reaching up with the special pole that's used for harvesting saguaro fruit. And that, look at that photo. Everything about what she's doing is amazing, challenging, difficult, and yet the fruit itself is the reward for undertaking this incredible effort. So I'm going to read from an article about their camp, and this is a firsthand description of it. One fruit harvest participant wrote, "Of good camp manners and of sensuous pleasure, you eat the perfect ones of the saguaro fruit on the spot, turning your back to the other harvesters. You chew the oily seeds into thick syrup before you swallow. It feels luscious and wicked, but no one says anything back in camp. Everyone's mouth is pink and sticky." And you may read more about that from the National Park Service that wrote a history of this family's tradition that has gone on at Sonoran National Park. And that gives you a little sense of the sense of place, as well as the flavors, and really the pleasure of enjoying wild foods. Switching over to Senevere Co-op Farm. So harvesting saguaro fruit is something really very much about going into the field and harvesting wild foods. Senevere Farm Co-op's a farm, and yet it is also a center for reviving wild food harvesting among the Tohono O'odham Nation. And so it purchases cholla buds, prickly pear fruit, and mesquite pods from the tribal members who will harvest them and bring them to Senevere Co-op Farm. And then these foods are processed and sold. And now, because of this program, we may be able to order these foods from their website online, buy them directly from the farm stand when it's open, and also find them in grocery stores around Tucson. There's also an event center. So if you can see the photos here, we have a photo of dried mesquite pods, a lot of them, which are packaged as mesquite meal, and you can get them in packages. You can also get them in bulk from certain places around town. The middle picture is this beautiful event center that they have, and it's currently, that's not open to the public at this moment, but if you ever do need to have a meeting or a retreat, look into it, reach out to the Sanavir co-op farm and see if it's appropriate for you to rent the event center, because they have their own caterer, their own chef on site for catering events. It's a very modern kitchen with wonderful contemporary cuisine using wild foods. And the bottom photograph is a photo of cholla buds that you may now source because of the Sanavir co-op farm. You may get dried cholla buds that you can use in different cooking. So the story behind Sanavir Co-op Farm is a story that affected probably all of the farming people who are Native Americans in Arizona at some point in recent times. And that was they had to fight for their water rights. And that in itself is a whole probably volumes worth of history. So the farming practices after a culture that had probably invented many of the most sophisticated farming techniques ever to have been created in history in at least 5,500 years ago, the water table dropped so much that farming was no longer possible. And so these same tribes had to sue to get water rights again. And that was what restored farming very recently. So Sanavir stopped around the 1960s-ish because they simply couldn't grow crops without water. And they restored their water rights and the farm as recently as 2008. So the stories are very complex, very interesting if you like to get into legal history, but they're not the only ones. So that's why now is a time when finally ancient farmed foods are really coming back, and now wild foods as well are really coming back, because for a while it wasn't possible to create economies of scale and microeconomies around producing these foods to support the efforts. But now, fortunately, these are going on, and they are very successful by just from looking around and seeing their foods on shelves, their specialty foods that are now highly prized and treasured. Felipe Molina is a member of the Yome or Yaqui tribe, and he lives in the Pueblo in Marana. And he has been a scholar, an ethnobotanist, a foodways expert. He's authored books, and he's a linguist. He teaches, and he has appeared on the Wild Foods Tour. He's very hard to get. He's extremely busy, very busy man, and very much in demand among his own tribal members to teach the culture, the language, and the foodways. Here's from one of his publications. He says, and he's referring to the Pueblo in Marana specifically, a village elder recalled that many families went to the Tucson mountains to harvest saguaro fruit in the 1920s and 1930s. She said families would set up camps to harvest the saguaro fruit. In Marana, the Yoamem consumed many desert plants, but the wild greens were popular with the people. In the summer, the farmlands and the surrounding desert lands had abundance of wei, amaranth, totoiwaki or koniwaki, wild arugula, guarom, purslane, and kappa or chuali, lamb's quarters. And much of his work has been recording oral histories from his elders. And he's recording about 100 years back. And so he gives tours around Tucson with Old Pueblo archaeology, and his guided tours are wonderful. When he has given the Wild Foods tour on our tour, he will tell us a lot of things about wild foods that you would never learn from anyone else. One example is that there are songs that the young people had for each plant had a song. And you get this richness and this understanding and that you're only learning the tip of the iceberg of how much knowledge there is. And even that is a treasure, and it's really incredible. So we'll go on to Ramona Button. She started her farm on her mother's ancestral farm in Sacaton as a member of the Tohono O'odham Gila River Indian Reservation, and she started in 1974. And her story is pretty incredible because now you can find her foods in grocery stores, you can buy them online, and you know, you start to see them around, and it doesn't strike you as being all that different because now we're getting used to seeing these foods. But here's her oral history about how this happened, and it's pretty incredible. She says in the late 1970s, some community elders asked us to grow the bof tepary bean, which had nearly become extinct due to the lack of water that put many of the local subsistence farmers out of business. Ramona explained on her website. We discovered that my father had left a few seeds of the white and brown tepary beans in glass jars in a trunk in the old adobe house that I grew up in. It became clear to us, especially with the urging of our community elders, that it was to become our mission to bring the bof back to the community. We were able to get started with those few seeds of each color and learned how to produce the beans on a small scale. So it wasn't that long ago that many, many people suddenly became aware of the fact that a lot of native foods that were early agricultural foods, so going back to 5,000 years ago up to the 1970s, were about to become extinct. And there was a major effort to save seeds. And so people like Ramona Button were instrumental in digging out these seeds. And all of a sudden, now it was everything to learn how to grow these seeds again and to continue to develop them and share the seeds and make them available to others. And now we are so lucky that we can go to the store any day of the week and we can buy her tepary beans that almost became extinct. But there were a lot of people who kind of at the same time, it was a generation, started asking about this and started to get really interested in wild foods. And it was at exactly the moment where this knowledge could have been lost because it just had fallen out of favor. There were other options for eating. People's habits had changed. It's very hard to source wild foods. And people, the new generations weren't doing it anymore. So we're going to look at some of the people who were asking those questions, and mainly they were asking the questions of Native American elders because they were curious about them and they wanted to know, where did your foods go? Tell us more. And they wanted to know. And when they were lucky enough to have elders who worked with them and told them things, lucky for us, they published books and preserved the knowledge. So some of these people, and these are folks who are not necessarily academics. And again, these are people who are working right now. So if you wanted to take a tour, you could search on any of them and find out what they're doing now. They're currently publishing books and giving lectures and continuing their work at this very moment. So Carolyn Needhammer was one of the first people to go around and try to collect the knowledge in the very early 70s from Native American elders. Dr. Suzanne Fish is an academic who became the world's leading expert on the ancient Hohokam foodways. And that sort of informed people to the fact that the present day descendants of Hohokam people, the Tohono O'odham people, came from who have a very sophisticated culture. and have much to share. And so it urged people to try to find out what they might learn from these folks. Martha Burgess was someone who also asked the questions of where can I find tepary beans? I want to share them with the public and tell them about this great culture that has farmed these beans for so long. And she also created a website where she could sell wild foods. So she was one of the first people to try to distribute wild foods and herbal remedies and herbal traditional things as well, crafted from wild herbs and wild foods so that people could find them easily. We have the desert harvesters who recently came into being as really energetic permaculture neighborhood activists who energized tens of thousands of people all over the place to get excited. They're like bursting with energy and mirth, and they're sort of not at all academic in what they do. They're very experimentally driven. And so they sort of broke apart. Don't be afraid to try this. It's not precious. You can do it. Anybody can do it. And we have John Slattery, who is a bioregional herbalist and wildcrafter of foods. So we'll get into Carolyn. So Carolyn started her research in 1972, and I'm just going to start off reading this excerpt from her most recent book. So she's written 11 books, starting with American Indian Food and Lore in 1974. And her most recent, A Desert Feast, that published in 2020. And if you wanted to have the most general, comprehensive introduction to the food cultures here, including wild foods, A Desert Feast is exceptional. It's wonderful. So her quote is, "When I began researching Native American use of wild foods in 1972, Molly Manuel and her elderly aunt, both Tohono O'odham elders who lived near Santa Vera Mission, agreed to teach me some of the old ways. They instructed me to bring a supply of mesquite pods and saguaro seeds. They hadn't eaten them in years and said that hardly anyone still gathered and ate the wild plants their ancestors had relied on." So that's how far we've come. And it's because of people interacting with each other. And Carolyn was trained she was a journalism major and has a master's degree in journalism. And I think she just attacked this as a journalist would and had to go to all the primary carriers of the knowledge and get the information direct from them. And her writing is spectacular. If you ever want to read a cookbook where you will remember every single bit of information, I highly recommend her writing. It is incredible. And you'll find Carolyn is our wild foods expert on the Marana Gastronomy Tour, and she generously gives talks all around town. And so you can find Carolyn giving demonstrations and tours and different talks. So she is someone who's been very influential, and she likes to interact with chefs. So she is a major conduit of knowledge from traditional Native American elders to the chefs today. And more of the chefs are Native American chefs. So it's all coming around now full circle. And Carolyn was someone who started off, her earliest books are very ethnographic, oral history writing, where she's trying to faithfully reproduce people's recipes from their families that date back 100 years ago and more. And then as her books progress closer to the present time, now she's writing recipes from resorts, and it's like spa food, and it's chef-driven food who are now using these wild foods. So she's been this connector all along as everyone's interest in wild foods has evolved and changed over the last few decades. Martha Burgess is someone who has been very instrumental and key behind the scenes. She studied with Tohono O'odham elders, and then she immediately started teaching the knowledge as well. And she taught at the Tohono O'odham Community College. So she has been someone who's been connecting the dots for many decades. She was the one who started to look for tepary beans in the early 80s and led this quest, kind of drove the awareness that, wait, who has these tepary beans? Where are they? Where can we get tepary beans? And all of a sudden, everybody had to have tepary beans and know where they were. And it inspired other people to continue the quest to save native seeds. So, and she was on the board of Native Seed Search, the organization that was founded in the late 70s to save Native American heirloom seeds that are probably thousands and thousands of years old. And so she's been a co-creator in that organization, and she currently holds workshops and has talks largely at Mission Garden. So her quote from Carolyn's book is, "What you see are edible jewels. They are ancient treasures of sustainability saved from one generation to the next as appropriate agriculture, adapted and fit for the dry southwestern land long before deep groundwater pumping and commercial fertilizer came along." And that's a continuing theme in Wild Foods, is that wild foods, she's talking about tepary beans. So tepary beans are ancient, cultivated as sophisticated agriculture foods. Wild foods are very hardy and extremely resilient. And so they're appropriate for this bioregion. And they come along with extra nutrients because they are always in the ground, and they're hardy against the elements and weather changes and temperature changes. So you have all these different voices about why wild foods. And there are so many reasons why wild foods. We'll get to the flavors. We'll get to the flavors in just a moment. But Dr. Suzanne Fish is the professor and curator emerita, who I mentioned, whose work was foundational for the knowledge of Hohokam foodways. The Hohokam culture is said to have been bracketed about 1,200 years ago up until 800 years ago. And she has, I looked her up, and she has 615 citations in Google Scholar, and she's still publishing. So she'll keep contributing to the field. She and her husband, Dr. Paul Fish, who's in the upper corner picture with her, both studied the ancient agave farm in Marana. It's a 1,000-year-old agave farm. It has 32,000 rock structures that were used to grow agave plants that were planted by hand that would not have grown at the desert floor level elevation. They normally are an upland plant that's native to here, but they don't grow at the desert floor. So in order to get them to grow, there had to be some sophisticated techniques to make it possible that would trap more nutrients and water and moisture. So she doesn't confine her knowledge to only to agriculture. Her knowledge is all of the foodways. And so she also wrote extensively about the use of wild foods. And she comes from a background where this was all seminal research, and she would calculate the calories that the individual foods were contributing to the diets and weigh things and document them in a very clear way. And so she made it very, very clear that this was part of a really sophisticated culture, and that there was so much work to be done in studying it and documenting it. And she meticulously documents things so that people can build on her knowledge. And so along with that, she wrote, and I found this quote from 1986 that's it speaks to her genius, that it's so prophetic to now. It's really speaking to us right now. She wrote, several unresolved issues surround the beginning of agriculture in the Southwest. Each of these questions hinges upon firm dating of cultigen remains. So we have in 2019, 5,500-year-old remains of corn. How about that for being prophetic in 1986? So now we have the technology to date that corn pretty accurately, and it was found in exactly the same place where the 4,000-year-old canals, berms, weirs, and flood field irrigation agriculture was found. That was 4,000 years old. So if it was that sophisticated 4,000 years ago, all of the anthropologists can reasonably speculate it was sophisticated prior to 4,000 years ago, and it didn't just show up one day completely formed. So 5,500-year-old corn has been carbon dated to the same area in 2019. That's going to be world news. And it goes hand in hand with the wild foods, because the people who were cultivating the food 5,500 years ago were also heavily dependent on all of the wild foods here as well. So both were going on together, and we still eat wild foods now. We haven't stopped eating wild foods. So that factors into the next part in just a moment. To get caught up here, we have a couple more to go, and then we'll talk about where may we find wild foods right now, for dinner tonight. But this gives you a sense of how much work has been done behind the simple act of being able to go to the grocery store and buy these foods off of the shelf. People had to prove that they were edible because people had stopped eating them. People had to recover their lost traditions. People had to find the seeds that were hidden away in jars, in faraway places that they hadn't thought about for a long time, because we've changed our diet so much. So this is all part of the slow wave that has been building to now. And we get to desert harvesters who really came together around a neighborhood, the Dunbar Spring neighborhood, that's part of Barrio Anita, just north of downtown Tucson. There were so many people. These are the folks who I know have been part of it and have contributed to Desert Harvesters, but it's a loose group, and they've been incredibly energetic, and they brought the desert to their neighborhoods. So instead of going out to harvest and forage, what if you just could do this in your own front yard or backyard or median strip of your neighborhood or your neighbor's yard or commons areas? And so they were part of that movement in the 2000s, where they were retrofitting neighborhood infrastructure. And they were so good at it because Brad Lancaster was one of the key people who you may know from kind of reviving rainwater harvesting techniques that had been used all over the world forever, and here as well, because the ancient ones were some of the best hydrologists ever and farmers ever. So they knew how to manage water really well. So Brad Lancaster was like thinking about these things and how could he change his neighborhood with concrete sidewalks and curbs. And what if you tweaked that and turned it into a giant system for harvesting rainwater? So he invented the concept of curb cuts, where you slice the curb and it harvests the runoff coming off the street. And then you can plant shrubs in the medians and offset the heat island effect from concrete. And basically, the whole neighborhood came together to do all of these neighborhood retrofitting things. At the time, the city of Tucson was really supportive of it. And other cities, a couple of other cities, Seattle and Portland, Oregon, were also exploring how to create bioswales and other techniques for retrofitting urban streets to handle runoff events. And the desert harvesters were so successful, they ended up with just incredible amounts of mesquite pods because they were planting mesquite trees, which are native, which is the right thing to do. And then they were giving them so much water because they were successfully channeling the water that had not ever been done before in an urban setting. They have all these pods. What are you going to do with them? So they got a grant for a hammer mill and they started milling the pods, and it became a whole neighborhood tradition. And they would have a pancake breakfast, and it became a cookbook. And now to this day, you could see free wild foods cooking demonstrations at the Santa Cruz River Farmers Market as soon as that starts up again in whole, in its totality. And in 2018, they published the newest edition, Eat Mesquite and More, with lots of recipes. John Slattery is the last wild foods author, forager, who I'll talk about. He founded Desert Tortoise Botanicals in 2005. And he's someone who, again, reached out for traditional Native American elder knowledge of an ancient lineage of herbal medicine in this region. He studied with a traditional herbalist who's a Seri Indian tribal member. And he goes out and he wildcrafts. He gathers all the herbs and he produces very, very fine types of tinctures and teas and salves that are medicinal, that are appropriate for the desert. So his quote is really neat to end with, because he says, "At first, I saw the pursuit of wild foods as a survival technique, a way to live as people once lived long ago. I began adding wild foods to my diet in novel and conventional ways, parting with the traditions I had learned and fueling my passion for wild foods with my creative impulse to cook." So as these individual wild foods foragers have gotten more comfortable with the idea of just using wild foods, they've adapted them to their palates today. So they may have started trying to reproduce very traditional recipes that were used 100 years ago or 150 years ago. And now they've realized, you know what, it's okay to incorporate this with, goat cheese and salt and sugar or sweetener, and let's adapt it to our own palates so that we eat it more often, so that we can enjoy it because we are used to different kinds of foods. So that is where we're going to jump right in to where you may find wild foods today.
We're almost out of time, so just because our Zoom is going to go away, but go ahead with this. Yeah, go ahead with this.
I'll do this really quick. If you can take photos of this, I will also send you this presentation, everyone. I'll go really quick. The farm to table restaurants. The more farm to table a restaurant is, the more likelihood you're going to find wild foods, because that is part of farm to table. And the more classically French trained a chef is, the more likely you're going to find wild foods. The craft brewery here have adapted wild foods enthusiastically, and these are breweries that currently have wild food ingredients in their beers. Barrio Bread has artisanal loaves that will use mesquite flour that are sourced from Sanovier Farm Co-op. So let's see if we have a moment to do a quick little virtual field trip, and then we'll wrap up this quickly. Okay, I'm showing you an actual menu from Tumerico, a vegan restaurant that is like vegan soul food, and it's absolutely incredible food. Even if you're not vegan, it doesn't matter. You have to eat this food. And I'm going to show you where you can find some wild foods in the lattes over here under the cold drinks chalkboard. So the chalkboard is because the menu changes every day. Prickly pear lattes, mesquite latte. So you may have breakfast with wild foods. We're going to jump over and lunch. Oftentimes nopales or nopalitos will show up on the menu at Tumerico, but the menu changes every day, so you never know. We're going to look at feast here, and this menu changes every month. And I'm going to show you one really strange thing that I just found on here that is in a sandwich, fish sandwich, Cape gooseberry preserves. I had to look up what a Cape gooseberry was. It's a ground cherry. That's a very much of a wild food, and that comes from Peru. This menu is always changing. You can find all kinds of interesting things as ingredients. I'm going to hop over to, okay, yeah, Core Kitchen. Wait, did I skip PY here? We're going to go to PY Steakhouse really quick. PY Steakhouse.
Laura, I don't
Yeah.
think we're seeing what you're seeing.
Oh, you can't, I'm not sharing the,
Mine, yeah, I didn't know if you were going through, it's on your PowerPoint, but your slides didn't go and it came out of presentation mode.
oh, shooty shoot. Okay, well, let me go back into PowerPoint. Sorry about that, folks.
It's up on there, but it's just not showing.
Okay, it's not showing the screenshots of the menus. No. Okay, I'm going to go back to this slide then. So I was going through actual menus currently right now on the websites of Tumerico, Feast, PY Steakhouse, and Core Kitchen. And they all have menus that currently feature many different kinds of wild foods ingredients. So those are restaurants where you may go tonight for dinner or tomorrow for dinner, and you will find mushrooms, berries, exotic ingredients, as well as prickly pear, and other desert things that we've talked about today, in addition to many other wild foods ingredients, because these are chefs who really support the idea of sourcing wild and as close to your region as you can. And I'll leave you with this. There are many sources for ingredients if you want to cook yourself from scratch. All of the books that I featured previously all have recipes in them. And to get the ingredients, you may find them online. Santa Vera Co-op Farm is getting their website redone online, so that will be up and running. You may also buy their foods directly from Food Conspiracy Co-op in Tucson. Farmers markets, Native Seed Search online. You may purchase many, 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 many desert foods. Desert Tortoise Botanicals, primarily those are herbal remedies. Flor de Mayo Arts. We have markets where you physically could go into Thai Market or Maynard's Market. Sherry's Desert, you can go online. And then I have all of these sources where institutions offer classes and talks and workshops as well. So we'll get you this after the talk so that you can follow up on all of these if you wish. And I will wrap it up. And if we have any other questions or final thoughts, go ahead.